Yet this was not Michael's first cross-country road trip with his son. At the tail end of July, barely 5 months earlier, he had been riding shotgun in the passenger seat of the same white Hyundai as they made their determined way west from the Poconos to the Pullman, Washington campus. Back then, the air conditioning in the tight little car had been cranked up high, and the worry had been that the darkening summer skies would erupt in fearsome thunderstorms. Driving in the wake of mammoth 18-wheelers sluicing down the highway would be a risky business. And that time, too, Michael had found little that was pleasant in the prospect of such a disruptive whirlwind journey. The plan was that he'd be flying out of Seattle and heading back to Philly only days after he arrived. Nevertheless, last summer, he had decided it was a necessity to make the arduous trip alongside his son. To an outsider, such attention might seem overly vigilant, even controlling. After all, Brian was closing in on 30, a fully grown man by any standard. He would be a teaching assistant at WSU. He'd be lecturing and grading papers, a doctoral candidate, not some immature undergrad. However, Michael, according to several knowledgeable accounts, was resolute. He would not be deterred from traveling with Brian. And he had a head full of long-nurtured reasons for such careful paternal attention. Duty, the always beating heart of a father's love, fueled one strand of his thinking. His wife, who had a gentle maternal soul, might as well have been speaking for both of them when she posted on Reddit on the eve of Brian's departure. "My son will be in Pullman in the eastern part of the state, quite close to the Idaho border," she announced with mawkish concern. "He knows absolutely no one, and we have no family there. I worry about him being lonely." Michael, who knew a few things about loneliness, his mother, when he was still a teenager, had hightailed it to Las Vegas, leaving him behind in Brooklyn to be raised by a father who had little time for child-rearing, didn't want Brian to despair as he set out to get acclimated to life on his own in an unfamiliar corner of the country. A father's familiar presence, he believed, would help make the transition a bit easier. Last thing he wanted, given Brian's often unsettled moods, was for his son to feel the pressure of standing at one of life's crossroads all by himself. And in equal measure, it might be argued, guilt had been a motivator too. Michael wanted to make up for all he had put his son through. After all, it was one sort of handicap to raise 3 children on a janitor's salary. A janitor whose finances were such a catastrophe that he had to file for bankruptcy only a year after his son had been born. And it was still another sort of free-falling descent into abject poverty when, just as Brian turned 16, a besieged Michael felt he had no choice but to take refuge for a second time under the federal bankruptcy statutes. This go-round, when he emptied his pockets, all he could find for the court was $15 in cash and $49.77 in a savings account. It was not a nest egg that could bankroll the boy's college education, or for that matter, even purchase a pair of Air Jordans for his birthday. Trying to get by with only pennies in the bank was the sort of familial drama that Michael couldn't help but feel with regret might have laid the toxic groundwork for his son's turbulent adolescence. And Brian sure had had a rough go of things. That weighed heavy on Michael. Yet while Marianne would try to console rather than judge their son, relatives would say, Michael's reaction was more harsh. Exasperated, he'd lecture Brian that the boy was his own worst enemy. "Brian," he'd admonish, "you need to get your act together." He'd rail that the boy's problems were all of his own making. Nevertheless, there was one thing for which Michael knew he alone was to blame. And even after all the years that had passed, he couldn't shake off his guilt. He had turned Brian into the cops. It was an act of desperation, and yet that didn't diminish its sting for both the father and the son. Michael's father had a record for stealing a car on a trip to Miami, and now Michael had made sure his son would be branded with a similar scar. Grandson like grandfather. But at the time, Michael had just not seen any other way. His 19-year-old boy was out of control. The arrest, he'd wanted to believe, would be a wake-up call. It would be for Brian's own good. Brian saw things differently, but then again it was not his time for understanding. Nothing made sense, and nothing was all that he could feel. He had forged a kinship with despair, and it mattered little to him that his behavior, combative one day, detached the next, took a toll on his family. Something beyond his control was playing with his head. Mind fizzle, he'd called it. Looking for a remedy or even just a diagnosis, as Brian turned 15, he found solace in an online community composed of people who believed they were suffering from visual snow. This was a rare but painfully real chronic neurological condition that played havoc with one's visual perception of things. To the afflicted, the world was viewed through a glass darkly. It was like looking at a television screen, and the picture was always fluttering, the images obscured by amorphous grayish waves and scattered flickering dots. But was it a disease? Or was it a psychological condition? Doctors, according to the sparse literature, threw up their hands in frustrated confusion. They just didn't know. And what can't be diagnosed was even more difficult to treat. But there was no disputing that it sure took its toll on teenage Brian. If his online posts were a reliable guide, visual snow had buried him under an avalanche of unhappiness. Day after downhearted day, he went on the web to shout out his calls from the wild. I feel like an organic sack of meat with no self-worth. I am starting to view everyone as this. Everything I have ever done makes no sense. How did things get this way? I always feel as if I am not there, completely depersonalized. Constant thoughts of suicide, crazy thoughts, delusions of grandeur, poor self-image. It is like I have severe brain damage. I am stuck in the depths of my mind where I have to constantly battle my demons. In this high-voltage state, Brian couldn't decide whether his family was to blame for the maelstrom that was pulling him under, or if they were offering a life raft that could float him off to a safe place. In the end, though, he judged that he had sunk too deep to be saved. As my family hugs and celebrates, I am stuck in this void of nothing, feeling completely no emotion, feeling nothing. I feel dirty, like there is dirt inside of my head. But there was still room in this void for regret. I think about my father, what a good man he is, how I treat him like dirt because I have this condition and I can't take it. Everything in his life added up to less than zero, and Brian was resigned to this grim mathematics. It was even, he apparently decided, liberating. He could do whatever I want with little remorse. He was beyond rules, beyond laws. And he was angry. He went on SoundCloud to howl out a rap song that seemed to have been composed during a blizzard of visual snow. You are not my equal. You are evil, but I'm devil. Which, Michael grieved, made him the devil's father. Then Brian found a way to free himself from his pain. Heroin. At the time, as the second decade of the 21st century dawned, drugs were running wild in Monroe County, Pennsylvania, and their trafficking was an open secret. It was easy to score. Every teenager, or so it seemed, either had a connection or knew someone who did. In rural Pleasant Valley High School, where Brian was enrolled, it was as much a part of the gloom as the dirty bullet-gray snow that lay piled high for much of the winter on the shoulders of the narrow, twisting county roads or the junkyards littered with the rusting carcasses of abandoned cars. The local statistics on overdoses and opioid use were a heartache. Too many kids who had gone to Pleasant Valley didn't make it out of their early 20s alive, and their classmates spent a lot of time at the funerals of friends. For Brian, it was Jeremy Sabo, the happy-go-lucky kid with the mop of wild hair who lived 2 houses down. Sabo had started his official descent with guilty pleas to a DUI and a misdemeanor possession of drug paraphernalia and, undeterred, then spiraled further. He soon pleaded guilty for a misdemeanor, possession of a controlled substance, and after serving a year's probation, he celebrated his freedom only to end up dying, the coroner's report ruled, of an accidental overdose. And it was Sabo who, friends say, got Brian to try smack. But it was Ashley Flugel, a bouncy, free-spirited high school classmate who helped Brian become a junkie. They would routinely score from a dealer who did a brisk business selling stamped glassine packets of heroin from his perch adjacent to a local bowling alley, and then they'd rush off to shoot up. Bloody track marks, classmates recall with dismay, ran up their arms. Over time, Ashley had developed a serious habit, and it wasn't long before it all caught up with her. She was facing an intimidating array of drug charges, including a felony count of intent to distribute a controlled substance. But before her court appearance, she overdosed. Brian, meanwhile, was trying to find a way out. In February 2014, now enrolled in community college, he went to rehab. But it was a half-hearted gesture, and it didn't stick. It wasn't long before he was back using, and his habit had become increasingly expensive. Desperate, he stole his sister Melissa's new iPhone. He had to pay a kid he knew $20 to drive him to the local mall where there was a kiosk that bought used electronics, no questions asked, and he sold the $400 device for $200 cash. Then he went off to score. It didn't take his family long to figure out what had happened to Melissa's phone. Michael had had enough. Either Brian returned the phone to his sister, or he would report the theft to the police. "Don't do anything stupid," Brian warned. But Michael was in no mood to be intimidated. The cops came and Brian was arrested. True, it was more theater than retribution. As a first-time offender, Brian entered a Monroe County program. Accelerated Rehabilitative Disposition was the official name, that required no jail time, just a year's probation. After a year had passed, his record was expunged, and his heroin addiction was also history. As he was close to turning 17, a new version of Brian began to take shape. Determined to be a different man, he made up his fierce mind and lost, friends would estimate, well over 100 pounds of fat. Chubby, full-cheeked Brian was history, and a new, sleeker Brian with chiseled cheekbones, thick, wavy hair, electric eyes, and a swaggering smile had emerged. And he was determined to keep this new look. With a convert's fanaticism, the ex-junkie went full vegan. He not only wouldn't ingest any animal products, but he also refused to be served food that might have been cooked in pans that had once prepared meat. His body had become a temple, and now he was also setting out to turn it into a fortress. He started heading out for long runs over the countryside, taking boxing classes, lifting weights, and doing rigorous sets of push-ups. He was dreaming of turning fat into sinewy muscle. Where he once had a belly, he wanted to sculpt a six-pack. But in the transformative process, Brian encountered an unexpected and damn embarrassing problem. He had lost so much weight that the excess inelastic skin now hung over his lower abdomen and genitals like the bouncing flap on an envelope. It was gross, certainly not the sort of appendage a hunky guy wanted. So Brian went under the knife. It was expensive, but he had medical insurance. When Brian was wheeled out of the operating room, the surgeon had performed both a paniculectomy and an abdominoplasty. His abdomen and his lower belly had been expertly contoured to create the same flat, rock-hard torso he had admired on the other fighters in his boxing class. Brian was at last starting to feel he was becoming the man he was meant to be. He had always been intelligent, possessing the sort of mind that liked to bore down deep into things. But he just didn't have the confidence to exhibit his acuity. But now, it was as if he was trying to make up for all the time he had held his peace. He'd hold forth, his students would later complain, like he was the smartest guy in the room. And in Pennsylvania, his old friends, a ragtag collection of the sort of outcasts who, like Brian himself, had been bullied all through middle school, were bristling too. To hear them tell it, they felt betrayed. "Brian's acting all high and mighty," one groused. "I liked him better when he was chubby." But Brian apparently had no regrets. When he met up with his old crowd, he'd act superior, quick on the draw with a put-down, or he'd wrestle someone into a headlock and then prance around in a victory dance like he was the champion of the world. Brian wanted them to realize that he had moved on. But to where? He certainly hadn't become the player he apparently believed would come hand in hand with his new sleek look. The girls who had bullied the fat kid in middle school still didn't want to date the new reinvented Brian. Women, Dominique Clark, a classmate, would recall, found him odd, a creep. If he liked or was interested in a girl, and she wasn't, he just didn't understand why or just didn't accept her saying no. But he kept trying. A Tinder date with Haley, a co-ed from Penn State Hazleton while Brian was at Northampton Community, ended up with the frazzled young woman locking herself in the bathroom pretending to vomit just so he'd leave her dorm room. The desperate ploy worked, and Brian, the would-be Romeo, vanished passively into the night. But an hour later, he had the last word. He texted Haley to let her know that he thought she had good birthing hips. That was the clincher. Haley summarily blocked him from her contacts. Such was Brian's romantic life. But now he could make a fresh start. As he arrived with his dad in a sunny Pullman, Washington in the first week of August 2022, the campus was already a hive of activity, although the new semester had not yet officially begun. Everywhere Brian looked, a parade of sun-kissed co-eds scurried about in the seemingly prescribed uniform of tight cutoffs and artfully cropped tops that exposed tanned midriffs. Who could have blamed Brian if he felt the excitement that comes with the promise of a new adventure? Only Michael, a concerned father, had his doubts. He worried that Brian, or at least the unbalanced and complicated rendition that he knew, would keep to himself. And so when he headed out for a stroll and spotted Brian's new next-door neighbor in the apartment complex parking lot, he hurried toward him. Michael had briefly met Christian Martinez the previous day, when Brian and he were lugging the cardboard cartons up the 2 flights to apartment G201. Martinez, though, was not easy to forget. He was big and burly like a linebacker, and an intricate tattoo tapestry ran up his neck. Brian's shy, Michael explained. Has a hard time making friends. Martinez, who was by nature polite, listened sympathetically. Maybe you could look out for him, Michael suggested. Or the seething forces roiling around the Palouse. Or that it would not be long before the very mention of his name would be synonymous in Moscow with a previously unimagined evil.